I'm going to recognize the great senator from the state of Utah, Orrin Hatch, for the purpose of offering the benediction.
We'll be back shortly with more CBS News coverage of this amazing Republican convention. Well, the suspense is over, but not before one of the most dramatic nights in recent convention history, a night which for a while we were absolutely certain that former President of the United States was for the first time ever going to take a place as second on a presidential ticket, vice presidential nominee with Ronald Reagan. It looked like Gerald Ford had made a deal with him late this evening after former President Ford told us that the deal would have to include a great deal of responsibility for him. Apparently, they couldn't strike that deal after all, despite the fact that many of the floor leaders down here were told that the deal had been concluded. But then, suddenly, at the very last moment, Ronald Reagan, after his nomination, came to this hall. We heard from Leslie Stahl first that the deal had fallen apart and George Bush was the nominee for the vice presidential side of the ticket. And indeed, that is what Ronald Reagan told this convention just a few minutes ago. Leslie, you had the first word of it standing down there in those delegations, and for a while tonight it looked like the deal was made. It's fallen through. Do you have any further details for us?
Well, Walter, I have spoken to one of Governor Reagan's advisors who's been in the trailer tonight, and he tells me that in the end, Gerald Ford's demands were just too high and too steep for Governor Reagan to accept. That Gerald Ford's demands were too high. He said that he asked for a say and maybe even control over the NSC staff, the National Security staff, which, as you were saying before, may have involved some role for Henry Kissinger. And he also asked for some say over the domestic staff in the White House. And as everybody knows, I mean, that's pretty much the important functions that the president, the important jobs the president has to assign. And obviously, Governor Reagan thought that was too much to give away.
All right, thank you, Leslie. Dan Rather may have some more details. Dan?
Well, Walter, the word going around, and I say the word going around because what an amazing night this has been. I know you agree that you can hang around politics for a lifetime and not have a moment, have an evening like this. The best available information is, in the end, it was Kissinger that proved to be the difference. You'll recall that all through the evening it was said that Dr. Kissinger, along with Alan Greenspan, was the major architect of the structure that Gerald Ford had wanted and that it appeared that Ronald Reagan would agree to. Now, as the evening went along, according to those who were close to the situation, the Kissinger role in a Reagan-Ford administration, should that come to pass, came to be the pivotal issue. And as one of the sources said, in the end, that was the difference. Now, part of a reporter's role, of course, is to try to separate the rhetoric from the reality, the bullshine from the brass tacks, and one has to be cautious and say it may very well be that the deal fell apart on something else and the decision has been made to blame it on Kissinger. Who can say? But I'd have to say the best available information at the present time is that it was Kissinger's role in a Reagan-Ford administration, should that come to pass, about which the arrangement that had been tentatively struck fell apart. And I'm reminded that on the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite this evening, I think we ended that report by quoting one congressman who's been around today in all of the negotiations as saying, I'd be amazed if it was Ford. I still think it will be Bush, but I have to say that Ronald Reagan really wants Ford, and that until Ford unequivocally says no, then Reagan is going to stick with it. And in the end, apparently, Ford said no because Ronald Reagan couldn't buy the role for Dr. Henry Kissinger that Ford wanted Kissinger to have.
And of course it's possible, Dan, isn't it, that it never will come to pass in the sort of historical record of this convention that it was actually a role for Kissinger as such that blocked the thing, but it was conditions that Kissinger helped draft that would have created perhaps a role for him with Ford's blessing.
Exactly. That we may never know. If we do know, it may be a long time coming, because in the negotiations, everybody made it clear that there was a limit to what one could put in writing that Ronald Reagan would agree to, that a lot of it had to be a mutual understanding between people two men who respected one another, admired one another. I can say, Walter, as one aside, that it was cardiac arrest time on this floor tonight for the supporters of George Bush. They thought they had it. They had heard word from their own candidates' headquarters and around his hotel that it was all over. And when the word flashed, and it did come like a bolt of lightning through this hall, it's Bush, it's Bush, it's Bush. I really thought that a number of the longtime supporters of George Bush were going to just faint dead away. And then, of course, when they finally heard that the word was official, that's the way it was going to be. And then, especially when they heard it out of Ronald Reagan's mouth, it was the kind of dance that you expect to see in a disco, not on a convention floor.
If you thought that the delegates had cardiac arrest, what do you think happened to George Bush tonight? He was about to go to bed in the Pontchartrain Hotel when the word finally came to him. He's only a few hundred feet from this hall, as a matter of fact, at that hotel.
One of the things we know about George...
Dan, hold it just 1 second. Ronald Reagan is leaving the hall now. I don't know whether Nelson Benton is out there, is still at his post.
Walter, I'm here. Governor Reagan just walked into this crush of cameras with Mrs. Reagan. Hundreds of questions were shouted at him, and you couldn't hear the questions, nor could you have an answer. He is climbing into his limousine now, waving to the crowd that's around here. Some cheers went up. You see a couple of Bush hats around here. By the way, Walter, there was absolutely no opportunity for anyone to really get through this crush of cameramen, policemen, and Secret Service men to get to the governor. And as best we can see now, he and Mrs. Reagan are into the limousine. Authorities are holding back the crowd, and presumably Governor Reagan is getting ready to return now to the Detroit Plaza Hotel. I really can't see what's going on right now, Walter.
Nelson, we probably got a better scene of it from our television cameras on a high prominence there than you have, and what we see is absolutely nothing, except the cars are lined up, ready to go back to the hotel. Dan Rather, while we watch this scene, are you still there?
Yes, Walter, I am indeed.
I thought we might talk just a minute about the nature of the information that came to the hall tonight to these delegation leaders and others, which you were so diligently reported. All of our correspondents were beautiful tonight on top of every one of these reports. But the delegates and the leaders and Reagan forces and the other forces got the word directly from the Reagan staff that a deal had been made, as I understand it.
Well, that's correct, Walter. Now, there were you look at it as two tracks of information, as I know you've had to do in the past, and we've all had to do, that some of the delegation leaders were getting that word, and some very influential senators and governors, people who at least thought they were influential, were also getting that word. For example, Governor Jim Thompson of Illinois, and for another example, Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina, Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee. On the other track were those people who had actually been in the room today while the negotiations were being hammered out, and they were saying at that same time, we're now talking about the period, between 7:30 or 8 o'clock and 9:30 or 10 o'clock tonight, those people were saying, yes, it looks like it's 99% there. And you'd say, oh, well, and they say, well, the 1% could be tough. They say, well, I'll believe it when I see it. So you had two tracks of information going, but make no mistake that some high-ranking Republican office holders are walking out of this hall tonight mortally embarrassed. If not mortally embarrassed, certainly their faces are the color of a log fire, because they had told their own people, they had believed themselves that the deal was set, that it was going to be Reagan and Ford.
Dan, stick around. We'll be talking about this for some time yet, I'm sure.
Thank you.
For years, probably. Bruce Morton is with Reagan advisor Drew Lewis. Bruce?
Walter, I'm here with Drew Lewis. Drew, you've been in and out of these meetings all day, I guess, here a while and there a while. What did it finally, do you think? Why wasn't there a Reagan-Ford ticket?
Well, I think basically, Roger, that President Ford and the governor, and particularly President Ford in his heart, just felt that he didn't want to be vice president. He felt that he'd be more effective and could serve the country better in some other capacity and like to help the campaign.
Vice President not heavy enough of a role? You know, he wanted more genuine action than that?
I don't really feel there was anything particular. I do know when the governor came out, he just stated it very simply that President Ford felt he could better serve the country in some other capacity, and Governor Reagan then took immediate action and was obviously pleased that Ambassador Bush agreed to be his running mate. And I think we have a very, very strong ticket. I'm delighted.
Are you worried now that Bush is going to get tagged as the second choice?
Oh, not at all. I don't think George Bush can ever be a second choice to anybody, and to be asked to be Vice President of the United States and be a running mate for Ronald Reagan has to be a great honor if you're the 25th choice. I wasn't even on the list.
You could argue that it's a better ticket this way. I don't know what your preference was going into all these talks. But
I think it's the strongest possible ticket we could have. I think that George Bush adds a dimension to the Reagan campaign that's important. I think he's going to run very strong and help the ticket in the Northeast and the Midwest. And I really think it's the strongest ticket we could have, regardless of whomever could have been the vice presidential selection.
Drew, thank you. Walter?
Thank you, Bruce. Morton Dean and Susan Spencer have more details on this surprising development.
Walter, surprise is an understatement. I just couldn't believe what happened before us this evening. It was Ford, 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 and then, as we all reported, it began to slip away, and suddenly Leslie said Bush, and within seconds we were up and down the aisles, and people were saying, we've just heard from the Reagan people, it's not Ford, it's Bush. There were really two sets of comments here on the floor when many of us were certain it was going to be the former president. The rank-and-file delegates seemed to be saying that they were delighted. They foresaw a good campaign and a positive election night. But some of the elected officials here, and I'm sure Susan will agree with me, such as Congressman Conable of New York and others, worried just how that would work. They could not quite see a former president running with a former governor.
Very few who would admit it openly, but the few who did were concerned about this whole idea of a co-presidency and whether or not that was feasible and whether it was really fair to ask a former president to suddenly be the second man on the ticket and whether he could really cope with that, knowing what the duties of the president were. But I've never seen so much money exchange hands in my life, and people who 5 minutes earlier had sworn that it was Gerald Ford and knew, you know, from the highest authority on everything, instantly, when those whips came down the aisles, the whole place suddenly was omniscient again, and it was going to be George Bush. I think most of them hadn't really believed Ford would take it anyway. Not really.
And Susan and Walter, I think what happened tonight, though, was that the Reagan people sent a very important signal to the nation and to our allies overseas that it's quite likely that Gerald Ford will play a prominent role in the campaign and perhaps even play a more prominent role in a Reagan administration if he succeeds in November than many people would have expected before tonight. The negotiations were fruitful at least to a 95% point.
And presumably the two men have patched up any differences that had remained from 1976. CBS News coverage of the Republican convention will come back in a moment.
When he came to Detroit was said, look, let's try a moderate departure from principle or from tradition of the old principles, and let's pursue it moderately. As they tried to pursue this with former President Ford, they found that there was a difference between what Governor Reagan had in mind, which was a moderate enhancement of an office that is remarkably unformed in our country, and a somewhat radical improvisation that Governor Reagan thought might threaten the constitutional equilibrium. He drew a line clearly between those, and it was on that, I think, in the end, that finally the negotiations fell apart. There came a point of principle he would not cross, and a point in time that he could not let this proceed, because he couldn't let the country go to bed and Europe go through a day, believing that, as people did believe by 11 o'clock last night, that the Ford-Reagan ticket was an accomplished fact. So I believe that it was a moderate undertaking, decisively begun and cleanly and decisively ended with very little damage.
On the other hand, George, you know, the country did spend these hours last night hearing all about Gerald R. Ford rather than about Governor Reagan. And I'm reminded, too, of the fact that not so very many months ago, Governor Reagan thought it might not be a bad idea to come to the convention and present the convention with, say, 3 names and say, go ahead and make your choice.
Well,
If that was rejected, however, on the grounds that it would display or reflect perhaps a certain indecisiveness.
Yes, but look what would have happened had he done that. Had he come here and said, take your choice from all the people, you would have got first a vote for Ford, and if Ford had turned it down, you would have got a vote for Bush. So in effect, you had, in the outcome, what was anticipated.
George, wouldn't he be better off not to try it at this late stage? I agree with you that in the long range, he's probably not damaged by it, but short range, it looked like a pretty inept performance last night. And what did it really accomplish?
Well, eptness or ineptness is in the eye of the beholder, and I didn't think it looked inept at all. I thought it was decisively handled and cleanly ended. I don't think there are certain kinds of negotiations you cannot conduct until you have a deadline imposed to concentrate everyone's mind. And you have the deadline produced by the schedule of the convention.
But beyond politics, Hal, I think politically, George Bush represents Gerald Ford's foreign policy in China, at the UN, and at the CIA. But we're talking too much about politics and forget what a great cultural event this is. And here we have George Bush as a Brooks Brothers man in the sea of polyester here. And by emigrating from New England to the Sun Belt, he is a one-man bridge to various parts of the Republican Party. The second major epiphany in New Hampshire, I recall, was after the National New Hampshire choke, was the gun rally.
Marty, I'm afraid, forgive me, I keep having to do this to you, but we'd like to keep people abreast of what's happening on the floor, and what is happening on the floor is that they're going to darken the house lights and go now to the film of Ronald Reagan. Let's join it.
He grew up in small towns in Illinois, a Midwesterner at heart. His father, Jack, was a salesman who followed jobs that led the family from Tampico, Illinois, to Galesburg, and finally to Dixon. Here, the young boy grew into manhood. And it was here, in America's heartland, that he developed his deep sense of values. The Reagans were a thrifty, hard-working, close-knit family. Luxuries were few and hard to come by. But to young Ron, nicknamed Dutch by his dad, life in Illinois was a rich and happy time. Young Dutch always had to work for spending money and to help out his family. Of all the jobs he had, his favorite was lifeguarding at Lowell Park on the Rock River. After high school, Dutch Reagan landed a football scholarship from the school of his dreams, Eureka College in Eureka, Illinois, sister college of TCU, Texas Christian University. His great loves at Eureka were football, drama, swimming, and making friends on campus and with the people in town. He did what he had to do to make ends meet, everything from washing dishes in a sorority house to coaching the swimming team after classes. Upon graduation, to pay off his student loans, Ron took a job as a sports announcer with a fledgling radio station in Davenport, Iowa, station WOC. His picturesque style of broadcasting let the listener see all the action. His reputation spread quickly, and he soon made the big time. Head sports announcer for WHO Radio in Des Moines, Iowa. Even today, there are a lot of people in the Midwest who remember Dutch Reagan as the voice of the mighty Chicago Cubs and the White Sox. One spring morning, announcer Reagan arrived in California to join the Cubs at their spring training camp. With a deep love for acting, the help of a friend, and a bit of good luck, he was soon offered a contract with Warner Brothers Studios. He became a star who appealed to audiences because he was so clearly one of them. Few knew it at the time, but he was also a peacetime volunteer Army officer. So with the outbreak of World War II, he put aside his career, signed on for active duty, and was transferred to a Special Air Force training film unit. 4 years later, Air Force Captain Reagan returned to Warner Brothers to resume his career. Little did he know that the most challenging period of his life lay just before him. Being a dedicated union man and tireless in his efforts to improve the lot of every working man and woman, he was 6 times elected president of the Screen Actors Guild of the AFL-CIO. As president of the union, Ron Reagan helped bring equity in salaries and working conditions for actors, technicians, extras, cameramen, almost everyone in the industry. More importantly, he single-handedly took on the job of keeping union members in control of the union and prevented a takeover of the film industry by organized crime. This crusade to preserve the freedom of America's working men and women kindled in Mr. Reagan a deep, abiding interest in the processes of our unique Republican form of government. He began to take an active interest in politics, both in California and on the national scene. He had been raised in a Democrat family by a fiercely independent father who was adamant in his love for freedom. In 1952 and 1956, following his own conscience and with a clear view of the dangers facing America, Ron Reagan volunteered as a Democrat for Eisenhower. In 1962, he officially joined the Republican Party. The rest is history. In 1966, answering the call of his party, he was elected governor of California. Next to president, the biggest job in the nation. More people live in California than any other state. It's the #1 producer of everything from farm goods to computer chips, generating 1 out of every $8 of production in this country. If California was a country, it would rank 8th in the world, nearly equaling the total GNP of the United Kingdom. What the new governor inherited was a state of crisis. California was faced with a $194 million deficit and was spending $1 million a day more than it was taking in. The state was on the brink of bankruptcy. Working with teams from all sectors, the unions, banking, agriculture, education, and industry, Governor Reagan got things back on track. His common sense style and strong creative leadership won him a second term in 1970. And he won by one of the biggest landslides in the history of the state. Governor Reagan became the greatest tax reformer in the state's history. His program included property tax relief of over $2 billion. He reduced sales taxes by over $300 million and gave tax rebates of almost $750 million. The San Francisco Chronicle said, "We exaggerate very little when we say that Governor Reagan has saved the state from bankruptcy." When Governor Reagan left office, the $194 million deficit had been transformed into a $554 million surplus. And while saving the taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars, he improved the quality of life for the people of California. Scholarships for needy students were increased by 500%. Student loans by over 900%. His environmental protection program was the nation's toughest. He increased unemployment insurance by almost 60%. The head of the AFL-CIO said this about Governor Reagan. Governor Reagan has signed AFL-CIO-backed bills for injured and unemployed workers for more than $266 million. No governor, Republican or Democrat, has ever done anything like that. The efficiency and remarkable effectiveness of the government of California under the leadership of Governor Reagan became a model for every state in the Union. This is a man whose time has come, a man whose principles have been familiar to Americans for 30 years, a man whose accomplishments make him the natural choice for President of the United States. A man who believes that the decline of America must be halted and can be halted. A man who rejects the concept of lowered expectations because he believes in the boundless opportunities of the American idea. A man who has prepared himself for strong, creative leadership. Through all the years, the outstanding characteristic of Ronald Reagan has been confidence. Confidence in the triumph of the principles he has consistently defended throughout his personal and political life. This is the man who believes our nation can regain the stature it has lost in the eyes of the world. This is the man who understands the principles that make America great. Above all, he believes in America and the kind of strong, creative leadership that can restore our faith in the future. He calls not for retreat into the past, but for a confident advance into the future. The day Ronald Reagan takes office as President of the United States will be the day when America comes together for a new beginning. Together, a new beginning.
Well, the house lights will be going up. There they go. Now the delegates are going to express their appreciation for this movie. As promised, and as I suggested to you a few moments ago, the themes were set. Here's Ronald Reagan, folksy, appeal to the audiences, the unions, anti-crime. And here is former President Ford arriving in the hall. You see that. That's happening even as we speak to you now.
The following distinguished Americans to the committee to escort Governor Reagan to the podium. Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee, Representative Philip
We'll
Crane
have more
of Illinois.
ABC News coverage of the Republican convention from Detroit after this message and a word from your local station.
Senator Robert Dole.
Reagan has just arrived in the convention hall. He stepped to the podium, and the demonstration to greet him is well underway. He's actually a little ahead of schedule, but he shows some indication of wanting to start his speech right away as his wife Nancy applauds him.
A picture of Republican unity up there. They're starting to disperse now, but a number of former presidential candidates, among them Howard Baker, Bob Dole, and President Ford is directly below our booth. He's an observer. There's Howard Baker and Nancy Reagan exchanging a kiss. Guy Vanderjack, who had his moment in the sun here. There's the Notre Dame fight song.
Well, the Gipper has got the nomination.
You know who's looking exceedingly happy today? Betty Ford.
Yes. I'm sure she's relieved.
Although I suspect her happiness doesn't begin to approach that of the man you're seeing right now.
Show scenes in some of his films.
Yeah.
I'd like to see the Gipper make another run for it.
Well, they did. They hit all the themes that I expect we're going to be hearing during this campaign. In fact, some of the themes that you just saw on film, I'm sure you'll hear reiterated in Governor Reagan's speech. The business about working for what you get. A man who is of the workers, a former union man himself. And a man who's been able to run California, which, as was pointed out, if it were a country, would rank 8th in the world.
Not only that, Ted, not only was he a union president, but it is true, as he really admits, that he knew hardship and adversity in his life. One of the most poignant stories I've ever heard is the story of the Christmas Eve back in Illinois. Well, here he goes now. We are going to have, as this demonstration will continue for some time, and much of it will be fairly repetitious, we're going to go to London, where Independent Party candidate John Anderson is standing by. Mr. Anderson is up quite early in the morning or late at night, as you choose. And we'll have more of ABC News coverage of the 1980 Republican Convention from Joe Louis Arena in Detroit in a moment.
Candidate, isn't it? It sure beats any homecoming game I ever broadcast.
Thank you very much.
Gentlemen. Thank you, Jim. Governor Reagan being interviewed by the correspondents there on the platform. Is John White still standing by in New York, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee? Mr. White?
I'm still here, Frank.
Yes, I wondered, Mr. White, what your appraisal of Governor Reagan as a campaigner is. At the moment, your side is way behind him in the polls.
Well, he has a lot of style and a lot of podium presence. There's no question about that.
he's as good or better than anybody in America today from the standpoint of the style. The question remains about the governor, and I think this convention brings it out more than anything that we have seen. In his speech, he talked about great defending the prerogatives of the presidency, yet just 24 hours ago, he was very casually bartering these away to a vice president. So we've got to take a look at the governor and see how he really views the presidency and how he really views himself. I think these questions will have to be answered in the campaign.
Mr. White, it was very good of you to be with us. Thanks very much indeed. We've got a long campaign ahead now. Wait a second, we're going to go down to the floor now because here comes the closing gavel.
Sine die. God bless you.
There you see it, the red, white, and blue gavel signaling the end of this 1980 Republican convention. We'll have more ABC News coverage of the 1980 Republican convention from Joe Louis Arena in Detroit in a moment.